Al Wired Fest. Dopo Game of Thrones passiamo a un tema completamente diverso. Parleremo di diritti su internet, dello stato di diritto su internet. E se mi concedete una battuta, si potrebbe dire che anche online ci sono delle Game of Thrones, delle battaglie nascoste tra diritti, poteri e questioni simili. Oggi parleremo in particolare di diverse questioni, parleremo di privacy, parleremo di sorveglianza, parleremo del modo in cui i diritti dei cittadini hanno una cittadinanza online, quali sono le garanzie e soprattutto come questa cosa che chiamiamo internet, che spesso ha un po' un afflato quasi mistico di libertà assoluta, in realtà sia soggetta a delle leggi, dei regolamenti e a dei poteri precisi. A parlarne qui insieme a me quest'oggi c'è una delle massime esperte in Europa e mi sento di dire la politica più esperta in Europa di questi temi. Lei è olandese, è un'eurodeputata del Partito Democratico olandese ed è sempre attenta a queste tematiche, fa un lavoro incredibile su questi temi in Parlamento e fuori, come oggi qui al Wired Fest. La nostra chiacchierata si terrà in inglese, quindi l'invito è, se volete avere la traduzione simultanea, di scaricare l'app del festival sul vostro smartphone e avrete la traduzione simultanea in italiano. Quindi per me è un enorme piacere invitare qui sul palco Marietje Schaake. Welcome, it's a great pleasure having you here today.
Thank you, it's
Thanks
always a
for being
pleasure
here.
to be in Italy and especially here with you at Wired Fest in Florence. Good afternoon, everybody.
So we have to discuss a few things about the internet. And last year we celebrated the 25th anniversary of the creation of the web. And my question is, in your opinion, how is the internet doing? What's the level of health of the internet in terms of freedom and rights, and how are we affected?
Well, I think we're at a crucial point for the open internet, and I think there's a risk that the full promise of what benefits it can bring to people around the world will not be reaped if we're not careful. So there's a couple of trends that I'm worried about. One is the overreach by governments that use top-down control over the internet because they're worried about what people may say or read or hear online. So that's one concern. The second concern is actually that I think there's a huge power by a couple of big tech companies that are also risking the benefits of the open internet from being accessible to all and instead use the internet as a major profit-making platform. And so because of the overreach by governments and by the private sector, the risk is that the internet will increasingly fragment, will fall into different little sub-bubbles instead of being this one open space where innovation is permissionless and where internet users' rights are respected.
This morning, for instance, we discussed with Gillian York from the Electronic Frontier Foundation censorship and how easily it is to take down content, especially on private-owned platforms, such as all the social media platforms that we use every day, like Facebook and Twitter and so on. So what's happening in this regards? There has been recently a new position by the European Commission about takedown, where they want to have the companies more involved. And so it's like, and the title of this talk is actually the rule of law online. So who is really in charge of the rule of law on the internet? What's the danger there, in your opinion?
So I guess I see the same trends translating to the way the struggle for freedom of expression online, access to information online plays out. So, for example, right now it's a very hot topic to talk about fake news. And of course, you know, it's easy to find some posts online that you don't like. But it's a big mistake to then say, you know, there are certain things we don't like, let these big tech companies, Facebook, Google, Twitter, just deal with it for us, if lawmakers or governments would say that, because then you would get this whole privatized law enforcement in the digital environment, in the online sphere. And we already see that there is a big difference between what the law might say is legal speech, which actually should go quite far in being protected, and what these private companies may think is appropriate speech, pleasant speech, etc. And especially an additional push by governments to outsource, let's say, the law enforcement of taking down hate speech or terrorist recruitment materials or fake news or materials that violate copyrights. You can easily see a slippery slope happening here where companies are made responsible for monitoring and filtering the internet in a way that does not have enough checks and balances that I think we need to have in a democracy for sure.
And this is also a matter of power. I've been doing the joke about Game of Thrones on the internet, but there is something like that happening where very big and growing private agglomerates like the big Silicon Valley companies are really gaining a lot of power over the internet. And one trend, which is a risky trend and a slippery slope, as you said, is that these private conglomerates get too much power. And this is also related to content removal, as we just discussed. But how do you think that that is changing the shape of the internet in a way? Is, again, going against the decentralization of the internet, for instance?
So I see two trends. I think on the one hand, indeed, these very big, very powerful private companies are increasingly shaping the internet. Mm-hmm. I guess we could say that increasingly digitization means privatization. Yep. And I don't think that that's a situation we should let go on without checks and balances. So you see that they are interested in maximizing their profit, and that's of course what private companies do. They try to make as much profit as possible, but by doing so, they increasingly create what we call walled gardens, so sort of subterranes on the internet, not only in our own European or American societies, but also in developing economies, for example. With the promise of bringing internet to the people that are not yet online, you see Facebook providing a thing called free basics to people in developing countries that is then actually supposed to sort of bring them into a very limited space of commercial content, some more public and independent websites, but really a subset of the open internet. So the lens of profit through which these companies look at the internet is not the lens of democratic values or the rule of law online. And in fact, we now see that it's not only a huge impact that these big tech companies have on the internet itself, but also on democracies. You may have seen the discussions going on in the United States about, did people with a political agenda from Russia purchase ads or fake news or placements of messages in light of the campaign for the presidency. And we see news dripping in that yes, there may have been ads bought for a couple of $100,000. Now I would be very surprised if it would only be a couple of $100,000. I think we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. But what's worse is that these companies allow advertisers to select criteria that are very, very dubious and sensitive. For example, you can select you want to push your advertisements as an advertiser to people who hate Jews, for example. And this kind of discrimination is not allowed in the offline world. So we really have to ask ourselves, how do we make sure that the rule of law, non-discrimination, fair competition, freedom of expression, access to information, very core principles that we deeply believe in, can also translate to the online environment, because the danger of erosion of the rule of law and democracy is unfolding before our eyes if it goes on like this.
You already mentioned the fake news debate, and now what happened with the political ads on Facebook. And this is strictly connected to the phenomenon of the spreading of disinformation over the internet. And platforms and the internet in general have been blamed of the reason why we have such an epidemic of disinformation, we might say. We know that not started with the internet, and definitely did not start with Facebook. It's from decades that we know what political propaganda and what deliberate disinformation is. But the public debate seems to go in the direction of, okay, this is because of the internet, this is because of Facebook. I disagree with that. And I would like to ask, what's the position, in your opinion, that politicians or public authorities should have in regards of this phenomenon? How to intervene in a certain way to do something about it without passing the border, just to quote the claim of the festival, and enter censorship, which is something that we definitely wouldn't want to have.
No, absolutely. I think if anything, rights like freedom of expression should be strengthened, not weakened. So censorship, and especially privatized censorship, are absolutely not the solution to, I guess, the category of junk news. I don't really like the term fake news because, you know, you hear all kinds of people saying with any message that they hear they don't want to hear, oh, it's fake news, you know. I'm just not gonna take it as a credible source. So the way to approach this is with care, but also not being naive. And so, for example, you mentioned the notion of political ads. I think it's a very good example. I don't know the details of the law here in Italy, but in most countries you cannot just place political ads in the media without being transparent about who pays for them or who they are supporting. You cannot just put allegations about anyone online in an ad or in a newspaper all the same. So I think it's important that we get more transparency about who is funding political ads with what agenda. Similarly, in the interest of public health, of course, you cannot sell any pill promising any cure because it could be very dangerous for people. So there are already laws in place that facilitate transparency, oversight, checks and balances, and what we need to do is translate those to the internet as well. Now, the tendency is a different one. I think these are difficult questions and a lot of, you know, thin lines to walk, and many politicians are inclined to want to do something when there's a challenge. So, for example, when we are faced with the terrible reality of global terrorism, or when we are learning about more and more junk news appearing, the push for them to act fast is very, very strong. But as a result, you may get knee-jerk reactions, too quick of a regulation, which could then stifle speech. So I think the starting point, beginning with principles, is always a good idea. Not so much the phenomenon, but really thinking about if we have this junk news, if we have rapidly spreading messages to many more numbers of people, messages spreading globally, messages spreading because of business models, is that the issue, or do we need to deal with transparency, accountability, competition issues? And so going back to those principles always helps inform me about, you know, what approach to take without being, without taking a knee-jerk reaction and risking to erode exactly those principles of the open society and the open internet that we have to defend.
And you just mentioned business models, and this is related to the private platforms that are, as we discussed previously, responsible for the rule of law in a certain point. And as we know, rule of law has to happen with transparency and accountability. And when I hear about filter bubbles on Facebook, for instance, that's the result of a business model. So discussing the privatization, for instance, of the rule of law, that's also an issue about accountability of these platforms, on how do they work. And should they be more accountable in those regards, in your opinion? What could be done? I mean, if we had a better understanding of what's happening on these platforms, what are the hidden mechanism of them, maybe filter bubbles could be, I wouldn't say resolved, but at least assessed and analyzed in a better way. So there is a need of more accountability also in that field, in your opinion.
So I think there should absolutely be accountability of anyone, including big companies, and I would say that with bigger power, also in the online economy, comes bigger responsibility. But instead, there seems to be this anticipation that as long as it's in the digital economy, regulation is not necessary. I don't know how many of you have seen the news that last weekend the London Transport Authority revoked the license of Uber. And the response was like, what an injustice, you know, this is crazy. Even though, of course, this is a democratically mandated public authority that is supposed to make sure that the rules in the public interest apply, whether it's to taxi cabs, for safety measures, for the treatment of workers, etc., or whether it's Uber or any other company. So I think we see in society that sometimes there are different expectations, and some of these companies play with that. They push as hard as they can until they hit the wall of regulation, and even then they cry out. But what's very interesting that we've learned about Uber is that it was not so much that they were not aware of the regulation, as they said last weekend, but rather that they're very much aware of the regulation, in fact tweaking the algorithm, so basically the whole system that's operating their tech platform in such a way that regulators were identified and were served a different kind of Uber experience than the average user, in an attempt to avoid regulators from being signaled about potentially illegal practices. So not only do they study the law, but they tweaked their software to avoid the law. Now, that obviously is a very dangerous trend. And so I think it is only fair to say that laws should apply equally with democratic oversight, etc. And if somebody wants to change the law, the way to go is through the people who are mandated to do so.
And one other issue that I would like to touch here today is the one of surveillance. It's now 4 years after the revelation of Edward Snowden, and so a lot of time has passed now, and it's already 2 years since the Court of Justice of the European Union decided to stop the safe harbor with the US for the data transfer of European citizens in the US. So some time has passed since we were made aware of how pervasive mass surveillance can be. And since then, we saw also that countries like Germany, UK, Switzerland, and others have passed new laws and new regulations to have more powers to surveil their own citizens and foreigners abroad. So my question would be, did we really had an understanding of what surveillance is and we try to defend ourselves from that? Or are we living again in a golden era of mass surveillance? What's your perception about it?
Well, I do think that over the past 4 years, the amount of public debate and amount of information to the average citizen has increased. I think before the revelations of Edward Snowden, there was much less general awareness of the very far-reaching impact that some of these mass automated surveillance systems have. But what I think deserves more scrutiny still is this constant use of the argument of improving national security as a blanket argument to justify any measure. I think it is often too simplified, and it requires us to be more vigilant. Not only because, again, if we're talking about terror, and I think terrorism is a horrible, toxic, very dangerous phenomenon that is global and that needs to be fought. But you cannot or must not allow the defense against terrorism to actually erode the very open society that you want to defend against. And in fact, that is happening. And I think especially on the internet, we have seen how contradictory these trends could be. So for example, in the name of national security, there are those who would like to weaken encryption. So the very kind of ways to protect your data better should then be weakened according to some governments, like in the UK. They make the case for this in the name of national security. But in fact, these kinds of measures, weakening encryption, would actually hinder cybersecurity. So it's completely paradoxical. And the same could be said for the mandating of backdoors, so entrances into people's devices, into digital networks for law enforcement, for example. As a lot of famous security researchers said in their article about keys under doormats, the idea that you can create a backdoor that only the police will use but that will not be used by terrorists or criminals or other people with ill intent, it's an illusion. So we have to think very hard about the intended but also unintended consequences of these kinds of policies. And I think too often, especially in Europe today, the argument of national security is used to justify just about any measure. It doesn't only hurt the freedoms of our own people, it doesn't also make us safer, but it also undermines our credibility vis-à-vis countries like China, like Russia, like Turkey, where the state takes very heavy measures in intervening in the digital sphere, requiring all kinds of centralized control at the expense of people's rights and freedoms. And so I worry about this negative spiral, because I think it's going to take away the quality of life of people, and it also destroys some of the potential promises that we still could build towards of the open internet as it was thought out about 25 years ago.
And surveillance is also something made with technology. And coming to this, because you mentioned some non-democratic or quasi-democratic countries in your last answers. And what we know is that, for instance, Italian companies are selling surveillance technology abroad, also to non-democratic countries. And this has been kind of a black market in a certain sense until a little time ago, and there was no transparency, no accountability of what was going on. Now we had more evidence of this, and also in Italy there has been a call by the Italian NGO Shield to have more transparency about this. So, and you know that you're also working very hard in this field to try to regulate this market. So what is going on with spyware technology, for instance?
Well, it's actually quite sad that we are here in Italy in this beautiful, beautiful hall in Florence, and you have so many people who are interested in technology, to report that when it comes to the export of ready-made commercial surveillance systems to authoritarian countries all over the world, Italy is quite a weak link in Europe. I don't know how many of you have heard of the company called Hacking Team or Aria. They are two Italian companies that were found out by investigative journalists to have exported very, very intrusive, commercially available surveillance, hacking, tracking, tracing, exfiltration systems that basically anyone can buy as long as they are willing to pay for them. And it is an irony, because on the one hand, almost every government, politician talks about the need to improve cybersecurity. And I agree, it's very necessary that we make robust and resilient infrastructure services, that we educate people and protect them against being attacked through their devices. But how come that we want cybersecurity on the one hand, yet we allow for the nearly unregulated exports of commercially available surveillance and exfiltration systems? So I think that has to change. And as I walked into this beautiful hall today, I actually saw a plaque posted on the building that said "Justice for Giulio Regeni," the Italian student who was brutally murdered in Egypt. And I fundamentally believe that all of Europe should push for justice to find out what happened to him and to the many Egyptians that are murdered and tortured and abused in Egypt as we speak. However, what is even more terrifying to think about is that he could have been traced in his every move through the phone that he used with the help of Italian technology. Now, is that a situation that is acceptable? I don't think so. So we are working on improving EU regulations that make for much stricter control before licenses are granted to these kinds of companies when they want to export these systems to anywhere in the world. So we look more clearly at how technology has rapidly changed, and we look more clearly at how these technologies do not only impact security topics, which are important, but also very much the human rights situation. Because right now, there's very little consideration for the human rights impact of the global market in these surveillance and other intrusive tools.
We touch a lot of topics here today. We started from the rule of law, we discussed surveillance, disinformation, and others. And since our time is unfortunately running up, I would like to ask you, how do you see the future of the open internet in, let's say, 5 years, in terms of what we discuss here, in terms of free speech and digital rights and so on? In which direction are we going? Shall we be more optimistic or more pessimistic about it?
Well, I'm an optimistic person, but I would really actually urge everyone who cares about the open internet as well as the rights of people on the internet, wherever they are in the world, to do more, to protect the open internet and the rights of people on it, because the trend is not towards greater rights, not towards greater promise of the potential of the open internet, but in fact the trend is towards more top-down control by governments, more profit-based push and control and walled gardens by big tech companies. And the risk of both these phenomena is that the open internet is going to be more and more fragmented, and it will lose its potential and its open character that has given us so much until now. So I really hope that this question of the importance of the rule of law and democratic values applying in the online world is something that you will take away from our interview today. So we need everyone to be on board for this fight of applying the rule of law online as well and saving the open internet.
I think this is the best way to close this interview. Thank you very much for being here. It's been an enormous pleasure to discuss with you this issue today. And grazie a voi per essere venuti. Buon proseguimento con il Wired Next Fest.
Grazie.
Thank you.